Come celebrate 10 years in the ultimate open world of Tamriel and play The Elder Scrolls Online for free, now until April 9th. Adventure solo or alongside friends on unforgettable quests slaying dragons, defending castles, and traversing wintry Skyrim or the mushroom forests of Morrowind. With no catch-up grind or subscription required and fun content no matter how long you have to play, start your legend today for free. Head to elderscrollsonline.com/freeplay, rated M for mature.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify POS has everything you need to sell in person. Go to shopify.com/system, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/system.
I'm Susan Swain, host of C-SPAN's Q&A, where we spend an hour with nonfiction writers and historians who add context to today's news. As the future direction of the Supreme Court is debated, our guest this episode is Ilya Shapiro, director of the Cato Institute's Constitutional Studies Center. His timely new book is Supreme Disorder: Judicial Nominations and the Politics of America's Highest Court. On this program, you'll hear from Pulitzer Prize winner Isabel Wilkerson. Her new book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, proposes that America's racial strife originates from a long-standing invisible caste system, which assigns people status in our society based on their race. Isabel Wilkerson, your new book is entitled Caste. What's its main thesis?
The main thesis is that we in our country, it's as if we live in an old house, and we often cannot see the pillars and the beams and the structure beneath it. We can often focus in on what we can see, or what we think we can see, but we often may not be focusing on the structure underneath. And so we have inherited a hierarchy that extends back to before the country was founded, back to the time of enslavement. And we live, even in this day, with the consequences of that original hierarchy, a graded ranking of human value in which people at the very beginning were assigned to categories not of their own making, but that were part of the service of creating what would ultimately become the United States, and that we live with the after effects to this day. And so the language that I'm using is language that we're not often accustomed to thinking of our country when we think of the United States, but the word caste, language that we often apply to other civilizations, but which are actually human creations that do give us a way of looking at ourselves through a different lens.
You write in the acknowledgments, this is a book I did not seek to write, but that I had to write in the era in which we find ourselves. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, the idea of the use of the term caste grew out of the first book that I wrote, The Warmth of Other Suns, in which I was writing about the outmigration of 6 million African Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South. And in writing that, I came to realize through my research that I was writing not about people just leaving one place for another, but they were actually defecting a caste system. So I use the word caste to describe the lives and the experiences of really anyone living in the Jim Crow South. And in doing so, I realized that when I went out and spoke about the book, I would find that readers really truly understood it when they could see what people were living under in the Jim Crow South for much of the 20th century. And so it was a place where it was actually against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. So it was after writing that book and then going out and talking about that book that I then began to think about the idea of caste, a word that I was using all the time when I spoke to any audience about it. But then there were such cases as Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin, a young man in Florida who was killed as he was coming back from a store wearing a hoodie. He was seen as someone who did not fit in the place where he was in that subdivision, that suburban subdivision in Florida. He was seen as suspicious on the basis of merely of what he looked like. And so I wrote actually about that. I made the connection then about caste, about how these enduring assignments and assumptions about who people are, where people belong, who is accepted and viewed as worthy in one space or another. And so I actually wrote a piece for the Times, an op-ed piece, connecting caste to that experience, and then have been thinking about that ever since. We have seen, since the time of Trayvon Martin, we have seen basically a metronome of names of people who have been unarmed people killed at the hands of police, or of homegrown professed vigilantes, you might say, who have taken upon themselves to take the lives of people who are unarmed people who just happen to be in spaces where they were not expected to be. And so this became an era that seemed to suggest that there was a way of looking at what we were going through a different lens.
You write that the idea of caste was still germinating in 2017, and then two conferences that you attended, one at UMass Amherst and another in London, really helped the ideas coalesce for you. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, the case in Amherst, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, was where I was invited to give a keynote about caste and the intersection between caste and race. And that was as a result of the research that I was doing. People began to hear that this, woman had, an African-American woman was researching this topic. Had been in India, and then they heard about it, and they invited me to this conference. And it was there at the University of Massachusetts Amherst that I began to test out some of the thinking that I had come to recognize as a result of the research. And starting with The Warmth of the Suns, I mean, they were quite fascinated by the idea that I'd written a book about the African-American experience in the South without really using the word racism. It's a word that does not appear in The Warmth of the Suns, although many people might assume that it does, but it doesn't. The word I use is caste. And so it was there that I began to get a chance to explore and to share the views that I'd come to recognize, not only as someone who had researched it, but also was experiencing it as well. So that all of these things came to coalesce in that space. And as I talked about it, it turned out that I felt such a deep connection to people who were Dalits, meaning people who had been formerly known as untouchables. And I found that the conversations came with such recognition of shared experiences without, across time, across oceans, across continents, that there was this shared experience. And so those were some of the experiences that led to my feeling that this actually was something that needed to be written.
Well, we're talking about the evolution of your thinking on these ideas from Warmth. Warmth of Other Suns is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year and is on the bestseller list. And I'm wondering what your thought is as an author about its enduring popularity. What do you think the secret sauce is for that book?
Well, I think that people always feel drawn to a story. The Warmth of the Suns is narrative nonfiction, and it tells this, much larger tableau about a major phenomenon in our country's history that does not get as much attention as it should. This time period between essentially the end of Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement. That era kind of doesn't get as much attention as it might otherwise. And so this was a way for people to understand it. The beauty of narrative nonfiction, and I think that The Warmth of the Suns reflects that, is that it's the closest that a person will get, that a reader will get, to actually being another person. So I spent 15 years on that book. Getting to know three people very, very deeply. First finding them, it was the audition for the role of being in the book, you might say, and then getting to know them very deeply, and then being able to share their experiences from a well of deep understanding because they'd shared so much with me, and then allowing the reader to be able to go along the journey with them. And in going along on that journey, you get a chance to experience what they experienced, to see how and why they made the decisions that they did, and the ways that a human being responds to the phenomenon and the circumstances that they might be born into, and that they have to make this, a pivotal decision. I mean, these are all deeply human circumstances. Any human being, can identify with the yearning to be free, the yearning to break from the restrictions that they might have been born into, and then the goals, the hopes and dreams that they might carry as they make their way across the country. And it's a deeply universal story. There's someone in all of our backgrounds, no matter where we might have come from, who had to experience some type of migration just for us to exist. And so I think that is what speaks to people. But as I said, narrative nonfiction it's the closest that we might get to being another person. We know that fiction allows us to build empathy as we get drawn into the characters that we're learning about and experiencing that unfold in the story of a novel. But in narrative nonfiction, we seek to allow the reader to experience that journey that comes from that we often associate with fiction, but it's true, it's real, these are factual, verifiable facts of real people who actually existed. So this gives people the best chance that they ever will get, I think, to actually be another person, to be inside the hearts and the minds and the spirits, the dreams, the wishes, hopes, the heartbreaks and setbacks that a person might go through. And so I think that's one of the reasons why people are drawn to it. I'll say one other thing, and that is that the experiences of people who were survivors of Jim Crow and were part of the Great Migration, and even those who stayed or whether they left, their experiences are become deeply familiar to those of us who may be observing what is going on now with when we see what's happened with George Floyd and many others. A lot of people look at The Warmth of the Suns as history until they turn on the news. So there's a combination of the story and the enduring truths that we can see unfolding before us, even in our current day.
How would you describe the style of Caste? It's very different in how you've approached it as a writer.
I ended up pulling together many pieces, having to explore and research into many disciplines, history, of course, but also philosophy, sociology, anthropology, all kinds of disciplines in order to better understand a phenomenon that is very, very old, an ancient phenomenon, but one that can surface in other cultures where we might not be looking for it or might not be expecting it to be. And so I would view this as a quilt where I was pulling from many, many different disciplines, many, many different previously written works, many, many different ways of looking at it, references to the Old Testament, the laws of Manu, references to what philosophers have said, references to Einstein. Just pulling all of this together in order to create a quilt that would, together, I would hope, be able to give us another way of looking at ourselves.
How did you decide on the subtitle, The Origins of Our Miscontents?
The subtitle was actually the working title for most of the time I was working on it. It was the immediate purpose and goal of the work, and that was to understand what was unfolding around us in the recent years, to understand what was unfolding around us, and to try to understand how and why and where this had begun, how to better understand where we happen to be. So the origins of our discontents is really truly the goal and the purpose of trying to get underneath the upheavals and the divisions and the tensions that we're living with now.
Well, the word caste, of course, is something that you're wanting readers to change their lexicon in thinking about our society. But other words that you write about, you also want to have us think about. One of them is race itself. And racism, which you write is one of the most contentious and misunderstood in American in American culture. What are you saying there?
Well, I'm saying that racism is a word that is a phenomenon that is real and has affected our country for as long as there has been a country. There's no question about that. What I'm saying, however, is that the word has become so contentious that I think a lot of everyday people may not even realize that there are actually formal sociological definitions that there are many scholars who have created life's work to understand this phenomenon. But because it has had so many different meanings to so many different people, it's often in some ways a misunderstood term. It's come to be confused or conflated with just hating someone or prejudice. There are all of these words that get pulled together and can obscure racism itself. What this book is saying and what I'm observing here, emerging from the research that I've done, is that underneath all of that is the infrastructure of the divisions to begin with, meaning the originating hierarchy, the graded ranking of human value that has been assigned to people based upon where they were born, what group they were born to, and where that group has been positioned in the hierarchy from the time, from even before the time that the country was founded, going back to colonial Virginia. And so because those hierarchies have been with us all of this time, what I am doing is shedding a light on, holding up an X-ray of the country so that we can see what is underneath these divisions, what is underneath what we call racism, that there is this infrastructure of division that predates actually, race as a concept. Race as a concept is a fairly new one in human history, dating back only 400 or 500 years. Before there was this coming together of people, either by choice or by force, onto this land, human beings did not think of themselves in terms of what we now call race. They were Irish, or they were Polish, or they were Lithuanian, or they were from the area now known as Senegal, or from Gambia, wherever they might have been, but they were not identified primarily on the basis of what they look like. If you were in Europe, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, 600 or 700 years ago, you would not have needed to identify yourself on the basis of your skin color. You were surrounded by people who look like you. That would not have been the identifying characteristic. It's only when people are brought together, either again by choice or by will, and are in what we now know as the country, the United States, the New World. Do these external characteristics that would have been neutral or had very little meaning before, then have meaning, or accorded meaning, you might say, here, once people came together. So this was a creation. We often hear that race is called a social construct, and this is a way of understanding how it became a social construct, how this was in some ways an arbitrary characteristic to use to rank people in a hierarchy that was requiring that there be people to do the work to build what was then a colony and into a country, and there needed to be the colonists felt that there needed to be people to do that. Of course, the great tragedy is that the people who were here, the indigenous people whose land this was, were driven off the land, and their numbers decimated. And then the colonists brought in Africans to be enslaved to build this country, and in doing so, thus created a caste system. Ultimately, what was really a bipolar caste system, with the colonists originating from Britain being on top, and the Africans who were brought to be enslaved put on the bottom, assigned to the bottom by definition, and then the indigenous people excluded and made outcasts in their own land. And this is essentially the framework for how the country was, the hierarchy that we have lived with all of these ensuing centuries.
You write in Caste that the human impulse to create hierarchies runs across societies and cultures. What did you learn in your research about the genesis of that human instinct?
Well, in the process of working on it, I came to compile 8 characteristics, 8 what I call pillars of caste, and they are the common threads, the points of intersection in any hierarchy that I saw occurring wherever I happened to be looking. And I would say that, one of the originating characteristics, which is pillar number 1, would be the role of religion, finding, or the laws of nature, the ways that a culture must find or chooses to find justification, often justification from the laws of nature or from some received wisdom from on high, to justify the degradation or the positioning, putting people beneath your group. There's this desire to find justification for it because these things actually are arbitrary. I mean, one of the goals of this is to remind ourselves of how arbitrary and artificial these divisions actually are. But to overcome those, the recognition, the natural recognition that one would have that these are arbitrary and artificial, a culture needs to have some justification. And so that was one of the things that I found and made reference to that as the first pillar, because that is the essential framework for convincing entire groups of people that they are above others and that others are beneath them, and then from that flows all of the other characteristics and mechanisms that are then used to keep other groups in a particular position, so that the group that deems itself above can maintain the resources and the primacy that they have been told, or that they have come to believe are their birthright.
I asked our producer to put those 8 characteristics onto 8 pillars, as you call them, onto a graphic that we can show to our audience. But the question I have as we look at them: do all castes share all of these characteristics? Are they all necessary to form a caste?
It's my contention that that's the case. I mean, I would say that in order to, I did a tremendous amount of work in order to be able to make the case that ours actually, has underneath it its underpinnings that there's this infrastructure of caste. And in order to be able to make that case, I identified these 8 pillars, which are present in any such hierarchy. They are present. And I would say that sadly they are present, because some of them are very, very difficult to accept in many ways.
In order to understand how castes function, your book research took you 2 places, India and Germany. Castes exist in other societies. How did you decide to zero in and focus on those 2 places?
Well, originally I was really focusing, first of all, the entire book is really about us. It's really about, it's about America, it's about our country and better understanding our country. So in order to better understand our country and these, long-standing, this long shadow under which we still live, why is this still happening? Why are the things that we're seeing still happening? And so that was the originating goal, was to better understand ourselves by looking at other places that had experienced what I'm describing here as caste. And so, of course, the first place that you would ever think of would be, Southeast Asia, and particularly India. So that was the original goal, was to really try to understand better how caste originated there, and to understand the framework for the caste system there historically. But in the process of working on this, Charlottesville happened. And after Charlottesville, I mean, we all could see the symbolism of the United States, the Confederacy, and of Nazi Germany in the regalia and the symbolism that the protesters brought together themselves as they were protesting the potential removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee. And we saw the tiki torches and the symbolism of another culture and another time reaching over to Nazi Germany in a way that we might not have seen before in such a big way, in recent times. So it was there that Charlottesville, where the protesters brought these symbolisms together, and it was then that I began to think to myself about what is it that Germany had been doing in the intervening time. What is it about Germany that the people and the protesters would see themselves in? What we saw in Charlottesville in some ways were questions of memory, questions of history. How do we remember our history? How have we absorbed our history? We're not on the same page about what our history has been. And so that's what set me on a course to looking at Germany and to the 12-year concentrated, essentially, creation of a caste system that the Nazis did during that time. Obviously, the most terrifying, horrific crime against humanity that ultimately it would culminate. And I wanted to understand, how did the Germans, how were they working through that history? How were they reconciling that history? How were they atoning for that history? So my initial goal was to understand how they were dealing with history, because clearly we were dealing with history very, very differently. But after I began to look into the history of how they were dealing with it, I then came to realize and to discover things that I had no idea, just were absolutely stunning. I mean, one of them was that it turns out that German eugenicists were turning to consulting with and in dialogue with American eugenicists in the years leading up to the Third Reich. I had no idea of that. It turned out that American eugenicists were writing books that were huge sellers, big sellers in Germany, very popular among the Nazis, and the Nazis were actually using them as part of their textbooks, which was just stunning and shocking to me. Now, the Nazis needed no one to teach them how to hate. They absolutely needed no one to teach them how to hate. But it turns out that the Nazis actually sent researchers to the United States to study exactly how the United States had subjugated African Americans. The Nazis sent researchers to study the miscegenation laws, the anti-miscegenation laws that forbade marriage across racial lines in the United States. It turned out that there were 41 of the United States that at some point or other barred marriage across racial lines, not just Black and white, but also people of Asian descent from marrying from white Americans. So there was the Nazis sent researchers to study that. They sent researchers to study how the United States had segregated, the Jim Crow laws of segregation in public facilities. They looked for all the ways that they had done that. They studied the laws of the United States and Jim Crow segregation as they were, and they went back to debate those laws as they were forming what would ultimately become the Nuremberg laws. That was stunning to me. I had no idea, and that is how I ended up ended up focusing in on these three places, because they all spoke to this idea of hierarchy and creating these artificial boundaries and these artificial rankings that would have such horrific endpoints, particularly for what the Nazis did, obviously.
Well, yeah, to that point, I'm sure many readers will be surprised, shocked to learn about the parallels between the Jim Crow South and the development of a Nazi code. But of course, the Nazis' ultimate goal was the elimination of populations. So how far does the parallel actually go when thinking about American society?
Well, you remember the subtitle of the book, and my goal with this book is the origins of our discontents, with an emphasis on the origins. And the focus for what I'm looking at is where are the originating points of intersection, and what can we learn from them. And the focus when it comes to the origins of for Nazi Germany would be the years of the 1920s, interaction with the eugenicists, both in Britain and in the United States, the early 1930s, as they were forming a government and creating. I mean, the interesting thing is the point, to your point, is that the 12-year reign can be instructive for all of us, because it started out in such a way as to begin to look for ways of legitimacy by looking to the United States. That's one of the things that they were looking at. But also the fact that they took a group of people who were among the most successful and accomplished people in these countries, and then converted them into a subordinated caste. They had to make them into a subordinated caste. You know, the horrors of that, and it happened over time, happened with each decision that they made, and then ultimately the final solution, which came later in the war. And so this is an effort to look at the origins of these hierarchies, with an emphasis on the origins of them, so that we can somehow learn from them, and obviously to make sure that these things never ever happen again.
The most exciting part of a vacation stay at a home rental? Easy. It's being greeted upon arrival with a rusted lockbox affixed to the underside of a stranger's condo. Yeah, you simply twist knobs, click gears, jiggle it, and then rip it off its moorings, and voila! Your prize is a key to a questionable home rental and maybe tetanus. When you just want to get your vacation started by actually getting into your room, it matters where you stay. At Hilton, we deliver your key right to your phone on the Hilton Honors app. Hilton, for the stay.
Looking to invest? Start your journey by exploring exchange-traded funds with Global X ETFs. Exchange-traded funds, or ETFs for short, create baskets of stocks, bonds, and other assets that you can buy in a single trade. Global X specializes in ETFs that track emerging trends, like the rise of artificial intelligence, as well as strategies aimed to generate income potential. Visit globalxetfs.com to discover how you can get started.
So thinking about India's caste system, and you traveled to India, it's so very different than the 12-year Nazi reign in that it's thousands of years old. So what did you learn about its structures, its permanence in society, and how did that affect the evolution of your thinking on American castes?
Well, I wanted to understand this because it's such a complex, ancient system that's based upon four main varnas, with Brahmins on the very top, and then subcasts within each of the four main varnas, and then there are the outcasts of the people at the very, very bottom, who are the untouchables. Then there are also an additional group that are essentially exiled in a different kind of way, similar to the way that indigenous people in our country are Adivasi. So there's a very, very complex system for which there are not in any way exact analogs, because it is so very complex and it is so ancient. So this is not in any way to suggest that they are the same in any way, but there are points of intersection and things that we can learn as a result of the ways that caste system which has been in place for so very long, ended up putting its bottom around the people who are on the very bottom, using some of the mechanisms that it's shocking to me that all three of these systems ended up using, independent of one another, across time, across space, across oceans and continents, that would end up using some of the similar mechanisms. And that was one of the things that that actually reinforced this idea that caste as a phenomenon is something that can be applied if one just understands what caste is to begin with, and the ways that it manifests along these different characteristics I've described. So one of them would be the idea of purity and pollution. Each one of these cultures made purity of the dominant caste one of the prime signatures of their hierarchy, meaning that to protect the purity of the dominant caste became a main focus. To protect the dominant caste from what would be known as the presumed pollution by proximity with, interaction with those who were deemed beneath them, assigned to the bottom. And across these three civilizations, these three cultures, water became this sort of central symbol of purity, water being, an element of life itself on our planet that humans require. And yet in each of these cultures, water became the controlling factor. It could be that, for example, the Dalit people, formerly known as untouchables, could not use the same well, certainly could not drink from the same cup. Would be unimaginable. There were so many restrictions. There was restrictions in terms of spacing that the lower caste people, and of course there were many thousands of subgroups that were considered part of the lower caste, the larger lower caste, but that there were some who could not be within 96 paces of someone of a higher caste. So there are very many rules and laws and restrictions. But when it comes to water, the Nazis as well restricted Jewish citizens from access to waters and pools that might have been, near their own homes, so that water became a central feature of manifestation or symbol of purity for the Nazis as well. One of the many things, of course, we know that many horrific things that the Nazis did, but they took the time even to make a distinction there. And then in our country, which is again the focus of this book, water became a central dividing line where many beaches were not, African Americans were not permitted to go to many beaches. African Americans were not permitted into the pools that were controlled by or intended for people who, in what I would call the dominant caste. There are many examples of people who actually, it could be a matter of life and death. In any of these cases, if you were to breach this central principle of caste. There was a case in 1919, the Red Summer of 1919, where a young man, an African-American teenager, was swimming off of a beach in Lake Michigan in Chicago, and he was wading in the water, and he waded into what was viewed as the white water, invisible line separating white swimmers from black swimmers. And he waded into the white water, and he was stoned to death for having done so. And that set off one of the many race riots of that summer, in which many people perished in that riot, and which itself was a response to the resentments and hostilities facing African Americans when they arrived from the Jim Crow South during the Great Migration. So the idea of water is one of the intersecting the points of intersection that was characteristic of all of these different cultures, again, across time, across space, not even necessarily knowing, but just doing this because that became one of the principles that seemed to be so important for maintaining the primacy of one group over another.
You tell us that Martin Luther King visited India during his quest for civil rights in the United States. We found a an archival clip of him telling that story in 1965 to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. It's audio, but let's listen, and then I'd like to have you tell us a little bit more.
One afternoon, I went down to speak in the southern part of India in a school that was attended by and large by young boys and girls who were the children of former untouchables. And I remember that afternoon that the principal got up to introduce me. And as he came to the end of his introduction, he said, "I would like to present to you a fellow untouchable from the United States of America." And for the moment I was peeved, I was shocked that I would be introduced as an untouchable. But pretty soon my mind ran back across to America. I started thinking about the fact that my little children were still judged on the basis of the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. And I had to say to myself, I am an untouchable, and every Negro in the United States is an untouchable. And segregation is evil and sinful because it stigmatizes the segregated as an untouchable in a caste system.
Isabel Wilkerson, what is it like listening to that 60 years later?
Yeah, I mean, I studied and researched that experience that he describes for quite a bit in order to write this book, and to hear his words, to hear him saying that, it's just, stunning and for me to hear. Yes, Dr. Martin Luther King himself came to recognize that we in this country live under a caste system, that we have inherited this caste system, and that it was self-evident to him as well. And it became evident, the connections between India and that ancient system and ours, though newer, carrying the same stigmatizing phenomenon that has held so many people back, in fact, the entire country back, I would say, for so long.
If we're looking for parallels to understand the United States between India and the U.S., can you explain the Dalit, which is the inheritors of the untouchable class after it was outlawed, and form the basis for political representation in India? How much power have they managed to accrue in Indian society, and what might that tell us about progress in our own?
Well, interestingly enough, the parallels continue. I mean, one of the things that I often say is people will often ask, why does this particular group do this or do that? And I often say, well, what is it that human beings do when they're in a particular circumstance? And so because there are similarities, they're not the same, but there are similarities in the way people are treated, the mechanisms for controlling these groups, that the responses might often, have some similarities as well. And so there has been a president of their system is different from ours. They have a prime minister and a president, but there is a Dalit who has risen to the level of president of that country several years ago. There are Dalits who have managed to get education and gone on to professions, as have been the case for African Americans. In fact, India abolished untouchability in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and so that they actually abolished untouchability and outlawed discrimination before the United States actually did in the 1960s. But that does not mean that the change in the laws leads to changes of heart, changes in behavior, changes in custom that have been in place for so long. I mean, I think that what we can learn from both countries is that despite the many advancements, there can still be the remnants, the residue, the shadow of the originating hierarchies that have been in place for so long and passed down through the generations, that they still can be animating forces in the current day. And that is what has happened in both countries. I mean, there actually was a Dalit there was a Black Panther Party and there was a Dalit Panther Party afterward. The Dalit people, many of them saw the connections and created a Dalit Panther Party. There have been a call for Dalit Lives Mattering as well, as in Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, because of the atrocities that still occur all too frequently and with great horror in India, despite the laws that have been in place. So I think in both countries, we have learned that despite the many indications of progress, and despite the laws that might have been changed, that there can still be this residue, still be this ongoing, unresolved challenges, because we have not really dealt with what's underlying all of this, which is the underlying structure of hierarchy itself.
You remind us, and many of us have lived through the, as you call, the major reckonings with race that the United States has had over its history. In Martin Luther King's era, of course, there was an enormous legislative yardstick for progress, which was the civil rights legislations, which ultimately passed in the mid-'60s. When thinking about today in the United States, what yardsticks can this society use to measure progress and change?
Well, I think that I'm not an expert on policies, and I want to present that. I am I'm like the building inspector who has presented the report. I like the radiologist who's presented the X-ray. This is what I'm presenting in this work. But I would say that one metric would be the numbers that we're seeing when it comes to people who die at the hands of police, mass incarceration, the numbers that we're seeing with the tremendous wealth gap between, and again, not rich gap, but wealth gap, meaning assets that a family or a household has accrued, and the gap between African Americans and their white counterparts, where the gap exists regardless of the level of education achievement. The gap exists regardless of the professional standing of the individual, that there is a gap between these groups because of the inherited advantages or disadvantages that were not a part of, that no one necessarily asked for, that you're born to a place in the hierarchy and you did not ask to be born to that place in the hierarchy, but as a result of redlining and restrictive covenants that allowed people in the dominant caste to purchase homes with government-backed mortgages that from which African American families were excluded. We have African Americans of today are descended from, or the children or grandchildren of people who had been excluded from the American dream, and the end result is this great wealth gap. That owning a home is one of the most common ways that a family builds wealth and builds a legacy for their children and grandchildren. And so this had been denied African Americans for generations, and of course before that, enslavement. So the measures would be the measures in which we can look at how are people faring. How are people faring, even factoring in the things that they may be doing to improve themselves, getting an education and hoping to get applying for jobs that are in accord with their education, and still not being able to get ahead. So there would be many metrics that we would have to look at now.
Your text references 3 milestone dates that give context to the story that you're telling in your book, Caste, and I wanted you to explain more their significance to our audience. 2022, 2111, and 2042. Let's start with the closest one, 2022. Why is that date important?
So 2022 marks the year that the United States will have been an independent nation for as long as enslavement had been in existence.
And so what is your thinking about that? What should people take away from that fact?
People should take away the idea that there was enslavement for so long, that it actually went on for so long that the United States has been in existence for the same amount of time that there was enslavement. Enslavement lasted for 246 years. It went on for 12 generations? How many greats do you have to add to the word grandparent, to begin to imagine how long enslavement lasted? It lasted from before there was a United States of America, and then went into the founding, past the founding of the United States, and went on for so long that it won't be until 2022 that the United States will have been a nation for as long as enslavement lasted on this soil.
And the related date, the 2011 date, African Americans free as a people for as long as they were enslaved. Tell me more about your thinking on that date.
It means that no adult alive today will be alive at the point at which African Americans will have been free for as long as they were enslaved. That won't be until 2111.
And a date
that's how long enslavement lasted.
And a date that is in our immediate future and frames the latter half of your book is the date 2042. What happens in our society in 2042?
2042 is a projected date at which there would be no majority race group in our country. In other words, the majority race or group in our country who would be white Americans would no longer be in the majority. That's a moment, a change in the demographics that no one alive would even begin to know what that truly means, because it's never been a case in our country. In other words, this is a historic demographic change in our country, and it has ramifications for everyone because no one has experienced anything different than what we're all accustomed to. It means that we have to reckon with who we are as a country. We need to recognize our connection to people who are descended from outside of Europe. It means that we have to reach across these artificial boundaries and to be able to find and to see the things that we have in common. Being American is the thing that we would say we have in common. What does that mean to be American when the majority is not what it has been up until this point? It's a moment of opportunity if we are willing to see it as that.
In the epilogue to Warmth, you quoted President Barack Obama's first inaugural address and called his election a change in the caste script. What were the consequences on America's approach to race in our society of his 8-year presidency? And I might add a more recent event, the selection of Kamala Harris to the Democratic ticket.
Well, these are tremendous, historic events that historians will be studying for generations to come. This was the first time that someone who was not from the historic dominant group was elected to the White House, elected to the presidency. There have been, if you think about just the symbolism of that, there have been enslaved people who built the White House. There have been African Americans who worked, as butlers and servants in the White House. But to have someone come in this way is just historic, obviously. This was a change for the originating hierarchy of our country, what I call a caste system. And when there are changes in a caste system, there are effects that occur throughout that system. I mean, I think I describe I have many metaphors in the book, and one of them is the idea of the many ways that the word caste is used in our language. And one of the ways that it's used without the E is a cast in a play. And so on that stage, when you have a cast in a play, you have everyone in their assigned positions, a stage right, stage left, foreground, background, and everyone has the script of their lines to speak, the roles that they play, and everyone is accustomed to that as long as everyone stays in their assigned role. But if there's a change in that script, if there's something that happens that is not expected, then everyone has to figure out what does that mean for them. They have to look back at the script and say, now what is it that we do? And that's what happens when you think about the cast. Something where there are roles and expectations and assumptions that are assigned or accrue to one's role in a caste system, in a hierarchy. And so we have seen with his presidency, we all saw the pushback and the resistance and the restrictions that were placed that would in some ways not be unexpected when you look at it through the lens of caste.
Let me move to outcomes in the few minutes that we have left. You write in the book, the goal of this work has not been to resolve all the problems, but to cast, there's the word again, a light onto its history, its consequences, and its presence in our everyday lives and express hope for its resolution. But let me think about your metaphors. I thought about them a lot as I was reading them. Either the bones of the body or the infrastructure of a house. Both of those things are fairly impossible to change. So ultimately, are these metaphors pessimistic, that a caste structure can't be changed?
I would not have written it if I thought that it could not be changed, that we could not find ways to push past these artificial boundaries. I mean, that's really why I wrote it. I have yet another metaphor having to do with when you go to the doctor. The doctor, before you can even see the doctor, you're handed this sheet, these forms that you're to fill out, and the doctor wants to know, before he or she will even see you, the doctor wants to know your history. They want to know not just your history, but your parents' history and your grandparents' history, and that is because before the doctor will even see you, he or she needs to know your history in order to better diagnose your situation, in order to help you with that situation, in order to resolve whatever your problem may be. And that is what that's what this work is asking. It's asking that we look at the history, because you cannot fix something if you cannot see it. You cannot repair something if you do not know what is going on. You cannot fix what you cannot see. And this is asking us to finally see, to be able to know our history. And when Warmth of the Suns came out, one of the things that I would hear time and time again from people after they read it was, they said, I had no idea. And I heard that from all kinds of people from all walks of life, people whose lives, in fact, intersected with and overlapped with the time period in question, and yet they had no idea. That means that we have a lot of work to do as a country to really learn the full history of what has gone before us, to better understand what we are dealing with now, what has happened before, so we can understand what we are dealing with now, so that we can work together to try to work toward a place of healing these wounds and these divisions, these fissures that we are dealing with now. And we cannot do that if we don't get on the same page about what our actual history has been.
So complicated this year by the pandemic, the economic downturn, protests in cities large and small, and heightened partisanship. So is your frame of mind ultimately optimistic about this country's future, or are you concerned about the short term?
Well, I'm concerned, yes, but I have no choice but to be optimistic, because that is why I wrote this book. I wrote this book in hopes that those who read it and those who take it in with an open mind and a willing heart will be able to see where we have come from and what the origins of how we got to where we are. So yes, I am hopeful that if people approach this with an open mind and a willing heart, that we will see how very much we all have in common, and that we will be able to reach beyond these artificial barriers, and to do this not just for ourselves, but for our families, for our children, for our communities, for our country, and ultimately for the species and the planet, because it requires it at this time.
Oprah Winfrey selected your book as a book club selection. Also, it's noted that she's sending hundreds of copies to public officials across the United States. What's the impact of that going to be, do you think?
I don't know. I can only hope that it will illuminate these truths to people who are in a position to really do something about it. All of us have a role to play, but the more influence one has, then the greater the responsibility and the greater the calling. So I'm hopeful that somehow all of this will come together to make this a better place for all of us.
In our last couple of minutes, you write in the acknowledgments about all the personal interactions you had with readers over the years after the publication of Warmth. people sending you letters and emails, what were they reaching out to you? What did they want? What was the genesis of their connection with you? And are you anticipating this book will have the same sort of personal reaction for readers?
Well, it already has. I mean, I hear from so many people who are saying that this is opening their eyes in ways that they had never been opened before. There are people who have said that they are, sending it out to everyone that they know, insisting that the people that they know and love read it. That was a similar response to The Warmth of the Suns. Warmth of the Suns was very personal, particularly to anyone who had been a descendant of the Great Migration, of course, but also people who were descendants of immigration from other parts of the world. It has a special place in the hearts of many people because it was a chance to tell their story, to hear their story told in a way that it hadn't been before. Because we often look at history with a big H, with big history. And this was a chance to look at the history, but through the eyes of the people who had lived it from their perspective. And, one of the thing you asked, what are people saying to me? One of the things that is so deeply touching to me that I hear more often than you would imagine is that people will tell me with tears of gratitude that this book, The Warmth of the Suns, was the last book that their mother or their father or their grandmother had read before they passed away. And these are often children or descendants of the Great Migration. And the reason they say that is because the people who endured this and survived Jim Crow often did not tell their children what they had endured. They did not burden their children with what they had experienced. They had experienced these traumas, kind of post-traumatic stress. They didn't speak about it. And so this book for many people ended up being the last book that they read before they passed away. And that allowed them to come to a place of healing, a place of validation for all that they'd gone through. And it's a profound honor to be told this by the children of people who spent their last days and hours with their loved one with this book and feeling a sense of gratitude for it. And that's one of the highest honors anyone could ever receive.
Isabel Wilkerson joining us by Zoom, which has lots of pluses in the age of COVID, but also we've had a few bandwidth issues along the way. I apologize to our viewers for those, but really appreciate the hour that we spent with you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Q&A. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll never miss an episode. And while you're there, please take a minute to rate and review us. You can also send us an email at podcasts@c-span.org with your questions, comments, or ideas. Your feedback is welcome.